URL parameters can be very powerful in helping us to understand where people are coming from. But quite oftentimes, it can be hard to actually capture and use those URL parameters. One particular use case is capturing a Facebook Click ID or even a Google Click ID. This is a short overview video that'll walk through the Facebook Click ID. And below this, if you're on YouTube, there'll be a link in the description to a longer video that walks through the full setup of how to capture Facebook Click ID and how to capture the Google Click ID independently. So if you want to learn the very detailed step-by-step instructions for how to do this, jump to those videos after you watch this quick overview. So we have this feature called capture parameters on. And what this does is when a user visits your website or loads a page with URL parameters, ListenLayer is automatically going to grab those, parse them, and push them into the data layer. And what that does is once they're in the data layer, it allows us to not only grab them in a tool like Google Tag Manager, but we can work with them more readily inside of the ListenLayer interface. For example, here we have a feature enabled called browser storage. And we have a rule here that says, save my Facebook Click ID. When I edit this, we have a condition that says when my URL parameters event in my data layer occurs, and there's this variable that exists called Facebook Click ID, then I want to go ahead and do something. And what I want to do is I want to get that Facebook Click ID out of the data layer, and I want to put it into the browser. Now, every browser has some ability to store information. In this case, we're using local storage. And of course, everybody's familiar with cookies. There's another storage method called session storage. And you can watch the longer videos to learn more about those individual things. But as the user visits our website and has a Facebook Click ID, and keep in mind that you can apply this to the Google Click ID as well, we're actually going to parse that from the URL. We're going to put it into the data layer. And then here, this rule is going to take it out of the data layer, and it's going to put it into the user's browser. And we're going to keep the original value. We're not going to overwrite any existing values when this occurs. And so what this looks like is if I visit a website here, you can actually see we have one already stored. I have this local storage key that now includes the value of a Facebook Click ID. And how I got this here is I simply just visited my website with FBCLID equals 1234. Now, because of my rule here, where I don't want to overwrite any existing values, even if I came with a new Facebook Click ID, my original one is going to be retained here. So the reason we capture these Click IDs and store them in the browser is to avoid a common pitfall that we see with a lot of setups where people think that they're actually capturing Click IDs. What they'll do is they'll parse the URL and they'll push it into a form, maybe into a hidden field or something, but they don't allow it to persist across pages and across sessions. So it will only work if the user visits your website, has a Click ID, and fills out a form on that page. And that's the type of setup we mostly see. So we always want to make sure first we're storing it in the browser. And once it's there, then let's say the visitor comes back 2 or 3 days later, they take an important action. Maybe they start a chat or they watch an important video, and we want to treat this as a conversion, or they fill out a form. We're going to actually get it back out of the browser storage, and we can do a couple things with it depending on our situation. So here we're going to use Gravity Forms as an example. There's a feature called custom values that allows you to push custom values into the data layer at a moment in time when a rule is met. And so we have a custom value rule, a simple rule, that pushes the Facebook Click ID into the data layer. And this is going to happen when a Gravity form is submitted or when it's loaded on our page. These are data layer events. And what we're doing is we're simply just going to get the Facebook Click ID, that user_FBCLID, back out of the browser storage, and we're going to push it into the data layer into a key called user FBCLID. So if we jump back to our data layer activity that we see here, we have under custom values, we have this thing called user FB seal ID, and it's 1234. This is being pulled back out of browser storage and put into our data layer. And the powerful thing with this is once it's in our data layer, at a moment in time like this when our Gravity form is submitted, we can create a tag inside of Google Tag Manager, for example, to grab that information and distribute it somewhere, to do something with it, to put it into a Google Sheet, to send it to GA4 with an event, or to store it in a CRM system, to send it to Zapier. You can do a number of things once it's back here in the data layer. Now, the other thing we can do is we can actually use a feature on our form listeners called populate fields. And what this does is when a form loads on a page, so you can see here we have a rule that says event GF form loaded. So that's our data layer event. When that occurs, we're going to kind of loop a rule, and the rule is going to go and it's going to look for a value inside of a browser storage key called user_FB seal ID. And it's going to put it into a field. Now, in this case, Gravity forms can be a little challenging because you could have the same field on 10 different forms and they look different. And so we're using what's called a CSS selector. Watch the longer video to learn more about how these work. But essentially, each field, each FB seal ID field that exists on our forms is just going to have user_FB seal ID in the class. And this is going to populate that with information. So back here in our data layer activity, we can see when we submitted a form, we actually have this field called input 6, and the value is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is our Facebook Click ID collection field. It's a hidden field on our forms. We're going to add it to all of our forms moving forward. We can even write a monitoring rule in ListenLayer that'll tell us if it sees a form that is missing this field. So that can be a really cool and powerful feature as well. If you want to walk through the detailed steps of this, watch one of the longer videos that's linked to below, either the GCL ID or the Facebook Click ID longer use cases. They're going to be almost identical, just slightly different because one, we're capturing the Facebook Click ID, the other one, we're capturing the Google Click ID. You'll learn a lot about the ListenLayer interface, and you'll probably start to find some ways that ListenLayer can help you outside of capturing URL parameters.